The machines beeped in rhythm, with a heart that had forgotten how to dream. For 6 months, Chidi Okafor, Lagos's golden son, the real estate mogul who'd turned red clay into glass towers, lay suspended between this world and the next, his body a temple no soul seemed to inhabit. The private hospital wing smelled of antiseptic and expensive lilies that Judith replaced weekly, more for appearance than affection. She was his wife, after all, the woman his mother had chosen from the finest political family in Lagos, the woman whose wedding photos had graced every society magazine, the woman who now sat in board meetings discussing his empire as if he were already buried. But there was another woman in that story, one nobody saw, one whose name was never mentioned in the marble halls of the Okafor mansion. Her name was Zara, and she was just the maid, the village girl from Enugu, who cleaned the floors, washed the windows, and every single day, without fail, entered that coma patient's room when everyone else had given up hope. She would open the curtains to let the Lagos sun touch his face, and she would talk to him, not about bills or business or inheritance. She talked about the rain that morning, about the okra growing in the mansion's forgotten garden, about the proverbs her grandmother used to whisper under the mango trees back home. Eze gidi niru, she would say softly in Igbo. Your king is at the front, meaning God goes before you, sir. So you must come back. The doctors called it pointless. Judith called it pathetic. But Zara believed that somewhere in that silence, someone was listening. The Okafor mansion stood like a monument to ambition in Lekki Phase 1, all glass and gold and imported Italian marble that clicked under designer heels. Mama Okafor, Chidi's mother, moved through those halls like a queen who'd built her throne with careful calculations. The right marriage alliances, the right social circles, the right daughter-in-law, who came with senators and oil money in her bloodline. She'd chosen Judith herself, had orchestrated that union like a master chess player, never once asking her son if his heart agreed with her strategy. And for a while, it had worked. The wedding was spectacular. The merger of two powerful families was complete, and Chidi had played his part with the exhausted compliance of a man who'd stopped fighting for his own joy. He worked 18-hour days, built his empire higher, smiled for cameras, and came home to a wife who kissed him like a business transaction. Then came the accident, the car crash on Third Mainland Bridge that the police called suspicious but couldn't prove. The impact that should have killed him, but instead left him breathing without living, existing without being. And in those 6 months of his absence, the mansion revealed its true nature. Judith threw parties, charity galas she called them, though everyone knew she was celebrating her impending inheritance. She'd appear at the hospital twice a week, for exactly 45 minutes, always when photographers were present, dabbing her dry eyes with Hermes handkerchiefs. Then she'd return to the mansion, to her secret phone calls with her lawyer, to her lover, who parked his Mercedes 3 streets away. Only Zara saw the truth. Only Zara witnessed the emptiness of those grand rooms where love had never actually lived. Zara had come to Lagos with nothing but a worn bag and her grandmother's prayers sewn into the hem of her wrapper. She was 26, but looked younger, with eyes that held the kind of gentle wisdom that comes from real suffering, real survival. Back in her village, she'd been the girl who sat with the dying elder women, who wasn't afraid of sickness or sadness, who somehow knew that presence, true, quiet presence, was the greatest gift you could offer someone in pain. Her family was poor in money, but rich in spirit, the kind of people who shared their last cup of Gary with a stranger, who believed that what you gave to the world would return to you sevenfold, if not in this life, then in the accounting that comes after. She'd taken the job at the Okafor mansion because her mother needed surgery, because her siblings needed school fees, because sometimes love looks like leaving home to serve in houses that don't know your name. And for 2 years before the accident, she'd been invisible. The girl who scrubbed toilets, who served breakfast, who disappeared into walls when the important people walked by. But when Chidi fell into that coma, something shifted in her. She couldn't explain it, even to herself. Maybe it was the way everyone abandoned him so quickly. Or maybe it was the dream she'd had 3 nights after his accident. A dream where she saw him drowning in dark water, reaching for a light he couldn't find. So she started talking to him. She started praying over him. She started pouring her own light into that darkness, expecting nothing, asking for nothing, just giving, because her grandmother had taught her that some souls recognize each other across impossible distances, and when you meet such a soul, you don't ask why, you just stay. The night everything changed arrived with a storm that shook the mansion's foundations. Thunder rolled across the Lagos sky like ancestral drums, and lightning turned the Atlantic Ocean silver. Dr. Emeka, Chidi's childhood friend, who'd become his personal physician, was checking the monitors when he saw it. A spike in brain activity, patterns he hadn't seen in months, responses that suggested Chidi's consciousness was fighting its way back to the surface. He called the family immediately. Mama Okafor rushed to the hospital, her driver navigating flooded streets. But Judith was at a beach resort in Elash, with her girlfriends, her phone on silent, her conscience even quieter. The staff tried reaching her 5 times. 5 times the calls went to voicemail. But Zara, who'd been in her small room in the boys' quarters, reading her grandmother's letters by candlelight, felt something pull at her chest. She didn't wait for permission. She wrapped her old shawl around her shoulders, ran through the rain to the hospital wing that connected to the mansion's east corridor, and burst into Chidi's room, soaking wet, breathing hard, her heart somehow knowing what her mind couldn't explain. Dr. Emeka looked at her surprised, but something in her face stopped him from sending her away. She went to Chidi's bedside, took his hand, that expensive hand that had signed billion-naira deals, that had never touched poverty or humility, and she held it between her rough, work-worn palms. "Sir," she whispered in Igbo, Biko, come back now. The storm is big, but your life is bigger. Come back." And as if her voice was the key that fit a lock nobody else could open, Chidi's eyes, those eyes that hadn't seen light in half a year, began to flutter open. The room held its breath. Dr. Emeka moved closer, checking pupils, checking vitals, his hands shaking slightly, because this shouldn't be happening. Not this suddenly, not without the gradual awakening he'd expected. Mama Okafor stood frozen in the doorway, one hand clutching her wrapper, the other covering her mouth. And Chidi's lips, cracked and dry from months of unconsciousness, began to move. Everyone leaned in. The first word from a coma patient is always significant. It tells you what the brain prioritized, what the soul held on to when everything else fell away. Dr. Emeka expected confusion, maybe a question about where he was or how long he'd been gone. Mama Okafor prayed silently he'd say her name, call for his mother, prove that her blood still mattered most. But what came out of Chidi Okafor's mouth shattered every expectation, every assumption, every careful plan. His voice, weak as a newborn's first cry but clear as a bell at dawn, whispered, "Wifey," and the room exploded with relief. Mama Okafor started thanking Jesus. Dr. Emeka began taking notes frantically. Nurses rushed in to adjust IVs and check monitors. In the chaos, nobody noticed that Chidi's eyes weren't searching. They were focused, locked onto something specific, something that made his cracked lips try to form a smile. At that exact moment, Judith burst into the room, her beach dress hastily covered with a designer jacket, her makeup smeared, her performance of the devoted wife slipping into place like a mask she'd practiced in mirrors. She rushed to the bedside, pushing past Zara without seeing her, reaching for Chidi's hand. With perfectly manicured fingers, her voice dripping with rehearsed emotion. "Darling, I'm here. I'm here. Thank God you're back." But Chidi's hand didn't reach for hers. His eyes didn't register her presence at all. Instead, with an effort that seemed to drain every ounce of energy he'd saved for 6 months, he turned his head away from Judith, his gaze moving past her expensive perfume and designer grief until it landed on the small, soaking wet girl standing in the corner. The maid who'd been about to leave, who'd been backing toward the door because she knew she didn't belong in these important moments. And Chidi's hand, trembling with the weakness of rebirth, lifted from the bed and pointed, a gesture so clear, so intentional, that nobody could pretend they misunderstood. His voice came again, stronger this time, each word chosen with the precision of a man who'd spent 6 months in silence, learning what mattered. "Wifey, you stayed. You kept talking to me. You brought me back." The finger pointed directly at Zara. The room turned to stone. Judith's face went from practiced concern to genuine shock, to something darker, a rage that she barely contained behind clenched teeth. Mama Okafor's hand dropped from her mouth to her chest, clutching at her heart, as if the shock might stop it. Dr. Emeka's pen stopped moving, and Zara, poor Zara, who'd only wanted to help, who'd only followed her grandmother's teaching about showing up for suffering souls, looked like she wanted the hospital floor to swallow her whole. She shook her head violently, tears mixing with the rainwater on her cheeks. "No, sir. No, I'm just the maid, sir. Your wife is here. Your real wife is—" But Chidi's eyes wouldn't leave her face. "I heard you," he said, his voice breaking. "In the darkness, I heard you." What followed was a war disguised as concern. Judith's family lawyer arrived within the hour, briefcase full of medical competency documents, ready to have Chidi declared mentally unfit to make decisions. "It's clearly brain damage," Judith announced to everyone, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "He's confused, disoriented, probably hallucinating from the medication. Dr. Emeka, surely you can see he needs psychiatric evaluation." But Dr. Emeka, who'd known Chidi since they were boys climbing mango trees in Onitsha, ran every cognitive test available. Memory? Perfect. Reasoning? Sharp as ever. Emotional response? Appropriate, except for one inexplicable thing. When they removed Zara from the room per Judith's demands, Chidi's vitals destabilized. His heart rate spiked, his blood pressure dropped, and he became agitated, refusing food, refusing medication, asking only one question over and over. "Where is she? The one who prayed for me? The one with the voice?" It made no medical sense, but the body doesn't lie. Somehow, in that coma state, Chidi's unconscious mind had bonded with Zara's presence, had wrapped itself around her voice like a drowning man clutching a rope, and now his nervous system recognized her as safety, as home, as the reason to keep breathing. Mama Okafor, terrified of scandal and desperate for explanations that fit her worldview, made a decision that would haunt her. She called Zara to the mansion's main parlor, where she sat on her throne-like chair, surrounded by her prayer group women, and she asked the question that shame and fear produced. "Did you use juju on my son? Did your people do something to bind his soul?" Zara, standing there in her simple uniform, looked at this powerful woman with something like pity, and answered with a dignity that came from a deeper source than pride. "Mama, I don't know any juju. I only know how to sit with people when they're alone. I only know that nobody should die without hearing a kind word. That's what my grandmother taught me. That's all I did. But fear is louder than truth, and scandal is more powerful than justice. By that evening, Zara was dismissed, fired, banned from the hospital wing, given her last pay in cash, and sent back to her village in Enugu, with a warning to never speak of what happened, or the family would handle her. She left Lagos in a night bus, crying silently as the city lights disappeared behind her, convinced she'd done something terribly wrong, that her simple act of kindness had somehow caused chaos, that she'd overstepped a boundary she didn't even know existed. Back home, her grandmother found her weeping under the mango tree and said nothing for a long time, just held her, just rocked her, like she was 5 years old again. Finally, the old woman spoke in Igbo, her voice carrying the weight of 70 years of watching life's mysteries unfold. NBUAOM, some souls recognize each other before their eyes ever meet. What happened was not your doing. It was destiny correcting itself. That man's spirit knew yours, because in the darkness, when everyone else saw a dying billionaire, you saw a human being worth saving. Don't apologize for teaching the world what love actually looks like. Meanwhile, back in Lagos, Chidi was deteriorating. Despite his brain being fully functional, despite having the best medical care money could buy, he grew quieter each day, more withdrawn, barely eating, staring at the ceiling, as if looking for something he'd lost. Dr. Emeka documented everything, troubled by what he was witnessing. It was as if Chidi's body was giving up, not because it was sick, but because it had tasted genuine care and couldn't return to the emptiness it had known before. The truth, as it always does, began to leak through the cracks of carefully constructed lies. Dr. Emeka, who'd been reviewing security footage from the hospital and mansion as part of his documentation, noticed something that made his blood run cold. During all 6 months of Chidi's coma, Judith had visited the hospital exactly 12 times, each visit perfectly timed with media presence or board meetings, each lasting less than an hour. And several times she was on her phone during the visits, laughing, texting someone who made her smile in ways her comatose husband never had. But there was more. The night of the accident, Judith's car was tracked by the mansion's security system. She'd left the house at 8 p.m., claiming she was going to her mother's place for dinner. But the GPS showed she went to a hotel in Victoria Island, the same hotel where a certain Mr. Dubim, an old boyfriend from university, was staying. She didn't return home until 4 a.m., 3 hours after the accident, 3 hours after the hospital had been calling her. 3 hours of mysterious silence. When Dr. Emeka brought this to Mama Okafor's attention privately, the old woman's face aged 10 years in 10 seconds. She'd built her son's marriage on sand and called it a fortress. She'd chosen status over substance, and now the bill was coming due. But Mama Okafor hadn't survived 62 years in Lagos society by being weak. She made a decision that required more courage than any she'd made before. She would face the truth, even if it destroyed everything she'd built. She traveled to Enugu, to Zara's village, unannounced, in a regular car without her usual entourage, looking for answers that money couldn't buy and status couldn't provide. The village square in Enugu still operated on the old ways. When strangers arrived with questions, the elders gathered under the ancient Iroko tree, and wisdom was offered like water from a communal well. Mama Okafor, dressed simply for the first time in decades, sat across from Zara's grandmother on a wooden bench that had held countless truth-seekers before her. The old woman looked at this city mother with eyes that saw past makeup and jewelry into the bones of her fear. "You want to know if my granddaughter is a witch?" she said simply. Mama Okafor flinched but nodded. The grandmother smiled, not unkindly, but with the patience of someone explaining rain to someone who'd only known drought. Let me tell you about Zara. When she was 8 years old, our neighbor's husband died suddenly. The widow cried so hard she couldn't breathe, and everyone was trying to comfort her with words. But Zara, she just went and sat next to the woman. Didn't say anything, just sat there, held her hand, and stayed. The widow later said that was the only moment she felt like she could survive. That's who Zara is. She has what our mothers called obioma, a good heart that doesn't know how to walk past suffering. Your son was in a coma, and everyone around him was fighting over his money, his property, his empire. But Zara, she saw a soul trapped in darkness, and she did what she's always done. She showed up. She talked to him about simple things. She prayed not for his wealth, but for his peace and his spirit. The part of him that was lost between worlds recognized her light and followed it home. The old woman leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of prophecy. You want to know about juju, about magic? The only magic here is the kind your modern world has forgotten. The magic of genuine presence, of selfless love, of seeing a person's soul before you see their bank account. Your son's spirit knew what his waking mind couldn't see, that this girl loved him not for what he owned, but for who he was at his core. And now you have a choice, daughter of Lagos. You can continue building with gold and lies, or you can start again with truth and clay. Mama Okafor returned to Lagos, carrying shame like a pregnancy, heavy, visible, transforming her from the inside out. She went straight to Judith's wing of the mansion, and for the first time in their relationship, she didn't ask, she demanded. Where were you the night of the accident? The question landed like a slap. Judith's face went through 5 emotions in 3 seconds before settling on indignant anger. How dare you question me? I'm your son's wife. I've stood by him through. But Mama Okafor, who'd spent her life reading people, reading rooms, reading the invisible maps of power and deception, cut her off with a voice colder than Harmattan wind. The GPS in your car says you were at Transcorp Hotel. The security footage shows you laughing in the lobby with a man who is not my son. The phone records that Dr. Emeka pulled, with legal authority I might add, show you called your lawyer 4 times during Chidi's first week in the coma, asking about inheritance timelines. So I'll ask you again, and this time the police are waiting for your answer. Where were you, and what were you planning? The mask shattered. Judith's composed face crumbled into something raw and ugly. And finally honest. You want the truth? Fine. I never loved him. You arranged this marriage like a business deal, and I played my part. But you don't get to judge me when you're the one who sold your son like a prize cow to the highest bidder. Yes, I have someone else. Yes, I hoped he wouldn't wake up. Because this house, this life, this golden cage, it was suffocating both of us. At least I'm honest enough to admit I wanted out. The silence that followed was the kind that comes before earthquakes. Then Mama Okafor did something she'd never done in her adult life. She wept. Not the pretty tears of church women or the performative grief of society funerals, but the deep, body-shaking sobs of someone who just realized she'd sacrificed her child's happiness on the altar of her own pride. The mansion became a battlefield dressed as a home, and within a week, the truth spread like fire in Harmattan. Through the staff, through the society circles, through the blogs that fed on wealthy people's scandals. Judith's family moved quickly to contain the damage, arranging a quiet divorce, paying off gossip columnists, spinning the story as irreconcilable differences discovered during his recovery. Judith herself left for London with her lover, her designer bags packed with everything she could carry and nothing that actually mattered. The lawyers circled, the board members worried, and through it all, Chidi lay in his hospital bed, growing weaker not from illness, but from a spiritual starvation that no IV could feed. Dr. Emeka finally confronted Mama Okafor. "Your son is dying, Ma. Not his body, his will to live. I've seen this before in patients who survive trauma, only to realize they're returning to lives that never fed their souls. If you want him to truly recover, you need to bring back the one thing that made him want to wake up in the first place." 3 days later, Mama Okafor made the journey back to Enugu, but this time she came as a supplicant, not an inquisitor. She found Zara helping her grandmother harvest cassava, her hands deep in the earth, her face peaceful, despite everything that had happened. When Zara saw the big woman approaching, she stood up, wiped her hands on her wrapper, ready to apologize again for a crime she didn't commit. But Mama Okafor did something that shocked the entire village. She knelt. This powerful Lagos woman, in her expensive agbada, knelt in the red clay of Enugu and said words that cost her everything. "I was wrong. I chose pride over my son's joy, status over his soul. He's asking for you. He's been asking for you since the moment he woke up. Please, if you have any kindness left in your heart, after how we treated you, please come back. Not as a maid, never as a maid again. Come back as the woman who saved his life." The return to Lagos felt like a migration between worlds. Zara sat in the car next to Mama Okafor, watching villages turn to cities, red earth turn to concrete, simplicity turn to complexity. She was terrified, not of the mansion or the wealth, or the society people who judged her, but of what she might see in Chidi's eyes when he was fully awake and realized she was nobody, nothing, just a village girl who cleaned floors and knew nothing about his world of board meetings and billion-naira deals. But when they arrived at the hospital and she walked into his private room, all her fears evaporated like morning mist. Chidi was sitting up, thinner than she remembered, his eyes carrying the hollowed look of someone who'd traveled far and returned changed. When he saw her, something ancient and familiar crossed his face. Not the polite recognition of someone you've met, but the deep soul knowledge of someone you've been searching for across lifetimes. "You came," he said, and his voice broke on the second word. Zara approached slowly, uncertain, and without planning to, she began to cry, not sad tears, but the release that comes when something too big for words finally finds expression. "Sir, I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to cause trouble, I just—" But Chidi raised his hand, stopping her with a gentleness that felt like prayer. "Do you know what it's like to be drowning in darkness? To feel yourself dissolving, forgetting who you are, why you should fight to come back? I was there for 6 months, Zara. 6 months, in a place where nothing was solid, where I couldn't remember my own name, but I heard a voice, every day, a voice that asked nothing from me, that expected nothing, that just spoke to me like I was human. A voice that prayed for other people's peace, that told me about okra growing in gardens and rain on zinc roofs and proverbs about kings going before us. And I followed that voice, like a river follows the sea, not because I understood it, but because it was the only real thing in all that darkness." He reached for her hand, and when their fingers touched, something in the room shifted. The machines seemed to beep stronger, the sunlight through the window seemed brighter, as if the universe itself was nodding in approval. "You didn't cause trouble," Chidi continued, his eyes never leaving hers. you revealed the truth, that I'd been living in a beautiful mansion that was actually a prison, that I'd been married to someone who never saw me, that I'd built an empire but forgotten to build a life. And then you with your simple prayers and your grandmother's wisdom, you showed me what it feels like to be seen, not for what you own, but for who you are. So I'm going to ask you something, and you can say no and I'll understand. But I have to ask, because my soul won't let me pretend anymore. Will you stay? Not as my maid, not as my employee, but as the woman who brought me home? The silence that followed was the kind that holds entire futures in its palm. Zara looked at this man, this billionaire who'd tasted death and returned different, who'd been stripped of everything but his soul and found it wanting, who was now offering her something that terrified her more than any hardship she'd ever known: the vulnerability of being truly chosen. She thought of her grandmother's words, of destiny correcting itself, of souls recognizing each other across impossible distances. She thought of those 6 months of talking to a man who couldn't answer, of pouring her light into his darkness, expecting nothing, of being punished for the crime of caring too much. And she realized that love, real love, the kind that survives comas and scandal and the judgment of a world that measures worth in bank accounts, isn't about deserving or earning or proving yourself worthy. It's about recognition. It's about two souls saying, "I know you," before their minds can explain why. So Zara, the village girl who'd never owned anything valuable, who'd cleaned floors and lived in servants' quarters and learned to be invisible, finally spoke her truth with a voice that was small but unbreakable. I stayed because nobody should be alone in the dark. I stayed because my grandmother taught me that service is sacred, that presence is prayer, that every soul, rich or poor, powerful or weak, deserves to be witnessed. I didn't stay because I wanted something from you. I stayed because your soul deserved to be seen. She paused, squeezed his hand, and finished with words that would echo through both their lives forever. And yes, sir, yes, Chidi, I'll stay. Not because you're asking, but because my heart already answered before you woke up. The months that followed rewrote every assumption Lagos society had about love, about class, about what makes a proper marriage. Chidi's recovery was miraculous, not just physically, but spiritually. With Zara by his side, he laughed again, genuinely laughed, in ways his staff had never heard. He restructured his company, promoted based on character rather than connections, and started a foundation for domestic workers' rights that made the news for all the right reasons. Mama Okafor, humbled by her own mistakes, became Zara's fiercest defender, learning Igbo recipes from her new daughter-in-law, sitting with her in the kitchen instead of on her throne in the parlor, discovering that real wealth was measured in peace, not property. Dr. Emeka documented the case for medical journals, trying to explain to science what the heart already knew: that consciousness responds to love in ways brain scans can't measure, that healing happens first in the spirit before it manifests in the body, that sometimes a poor girl's prayer is more powerful than a rich man's medicine. And when the wedding came, Chidi insisted it happen not in the grand cathedral where he'd married Judith, but in Zara's village under the mango trees, where her grandmother had taught her the wisdom that saved his life. He wore simple wrapper and beads, danced barefoot in the red clay, and when the elder tied their wrists together with the cord that symbolized unbreakable bond, every person watching knew they were witnessing something rare, not a fairy tale, but a truth tale. A story about what happens when souls stop pretending and start recognizing. The narrator's voice, calm and deep as evening river water, spoke over the final images of Chidi, and Zara's hands intertwined, her simple ring catching the sunset. The Igbo people say, Onye wetara unu miri, yaka unu ga enye miri. Whoever brings you water, you must give them water in return. Chidi's soul knew what his sleeping eyes could not see. That true wealth isn't counted in gold, but in the purity of those who stay when the world walks away. And so the maid became the wife, not by magic, but by destiny's perfect design. Because in the end, love doesn't ask for your resume or check your bank account. Love asks only one question. Did you show up when I was drowning? And if the answer is yes, then everything else, status, wealth, society's opinion, becomes nothing but noise. Remember this, children of Africa. The one who brings light to your darkness deserves your devotion. The one who speaks life into your silence deserves your truth. And the one who stays when everyone else leaves, that one deserves your forever.